Well, welcome back to this series of Advent devotionals that we have been diving into. And today we're going to be looking at a very famous prophecy talking about where Jesus was to be born. And if we know the Christmas story, of course, we know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in the town of Bethlehem. And so we find that prophecy spoken of in the Christmas story in Matthew. And so here's what it says. It says, After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So, who is the prophet that the scribes are talking about here? Well, it's the prophet Micah, because this prophecy is found in Micah chapter 5. And so I want to read it in context, and then we will dive in to what it can tell us about this King Jesus. It says, Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah. For from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. And so when we first jump into this prophecy, it starts with this really interesting line. It says, Muster your troops, O daughter of troops. And what this is talking about is probably an attempted siege on Jerusalem that happened in the year 701 BC. And so, to put this in context, you have King David, arguably the pinnacle of the nation of Israel, the height of their power. And then his son, he handed it to his son Solomon, who ruled with wisdom and yada, yada, yada. And then after Solomon, though, Solomon passed it on, and then the kingdom splits in two. It splits into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And over time, the northern kingdom gets conquered by the Assyrians. And so the Assyrians come in, take the northern kingdom into exile and captivity. And then after the Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom, they start moving down to attempt to conquer the southern kingdom. And so there's a famous siege by Sennacherib in the year 701 BC. And there's actually this artifact. You can find it in the museum in Jerusalem, and there's one in the Chicago Museum as well, called Sennacherib's Prism. And what this is it is a cylinder with inscriptions on it that talks about this very siege that we find in the book of 2 Kings. And so this is a siege that took place during the year of Hezekiah, when Hezekiah was reigning. And so this siege failed, but about 100 years later, after that siege failed, the next generation was taken into captivity under Babylon that came against the southern kingdom. And so, after Babylon, Persia takes over Babylon, and then Greece takes Persia, and then Rome takes Greece. And so, for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Israelites are without a king, without a land, and really without a people. But what they do have is this promise. They have this promise in the book of Micah. It says, For from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. The Advent season, as we talked about before, is about stepping into longing. It's about stepping into the longing of Israel. What is something that you've always longed for? Maybe as a kid, there was a Christmas present that you were just dying to get. And then you finally got it, and you realized that the anticipation was better than the gift itself. It's the idea of the gift that you were chasing after. With Israel, they were longing for a king. They wanted someone who would kick out the Romans or the Persians or the Greeks or the Babylonians, and they would set Israel up as this empire again. But what they got was so much better. They got a king who did not just establish an Israeli kingdom, they got a king that established a heavenly kingdom, not just here on earth, but also in our hearts. And through him, that kingdom will spread and expand, and justice will be done, and things will be made right. But imagine being an Israelite in captivity in Babylon. Or imagine being an Israelite who is being laid siege against by Sennacherib. And what you have is this promise. When that siege happened, it was right during the time that Micah was prophesying to Hezekiah. He gave him this prophecy of a coming king. Even though there will be years of darkness, we know that at the end there will be a light. And so the Israelites weren't the only ones that needed to hold onto God's promises. We need to hold onto God's promises. Look at what it says in 2 Peter chapter 1. It says, "His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises." So Peter says that God has given us these tremendous promises because even though the king has come, even though the first advent has happened, we are still waiting for the second advent. We're still waiting for that kingdom that is right now in our hearts to be established everywhere, for all things to be made right. And so, in the same way that the Israelites had to hold on to their promises of the coming king, we need to hold on to our promises of the coming king as well. How do we know that God is going to be true to these promises? We know that he will because of what he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He says, no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in Christ. All of God's promises find their yes in Christ. They find their fulfillment in Christ. And so we want to dive into those promises and we want to hold on to them as well. We'll see you next time.